Hey guys, it's Kim. Well, I'm going to try or attempt to do a demonstration today on my phone, which is set up on a sort of rack system behind me. But at any rate, what I'm going to do today is build a coffee mug. So I've gone ahead and started with a slab of clay, and the way I rolled this out was just simply with a rolling pin. So I've got one right here. I think it's really important that the clay that you have is about 1/4 of an inch thick. And the other really important aspect of this, as with any slab building, is that you compress the slabs really strongly on both surfaces. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. What I'm planning to do with this is to actually create one of my standard coffee mugs, and you guys have got the templates is a PDF file underneath the assignment page, and also some of you may have actually gotten the actual templates themselves. I'm going to talk about these in just a few minutes. But first, what I'm going to do is, as I'm preparing my slab, I'm thinking about the design that I'm going to actually transfer on the surface. And I went ahead and painted this azalea design early this morning, and I'm just going to prep it to actually apply to the surface of the clay. So the first thing I'm going to do, I've got a dry design that I've painted on newsprint, and I'm going to use a simple white slip to activate it, and I've got a brush here which will just do that. So I'm going to go ahead and brush that on. Now it's really important that this slip gets a chance to dry to the leather hard state. And what I'm after in the finished state is actually firing a coffee mug that looks like this. This is fired in my wood soda kiln. And you can see that the color actually stays fairly true to the initial design. And this is the prototype of the mug that we're going to be making. So with these templates that I gave you, the one that I have right here, I've actually made permanent by using a piece of lightweight plastic that I've gone ahead and copied this onto. I keep these then in a permanent state, and I don't have to worry about them getting wet or wrinkling or warping. So I'm going to go ahead and finish compressing the slab. And you want to make sure that both sides get compressed thoroughly. I normally use the rib in 2 different directions to make sure that the surface of the clay is really tight. And I'll always go over it one more time with the rolling pin just to make sure that the slab is even. Now I'm waiting for this to be able to transfer onto the surface, and you can see that the clay is becoming leather hard in most places, but is basically a little bit wet in a couple of places, and I think I'll just wait a few minutes on that. But one of the important aspects of this is when you're sizing up your coffee mug, if you look at this slab, when I hold it up, it's actually much bigger than the template that I'm using, and that gives me a little bit of space to actually aim for when I'm putting this down. And because I'm waiting for this to set up, and I don't want you guys to watch slip dry, I'm just gonna hit it a little bit with this torch to kind of dry up some of the surface, so I can go ahead and apply that a little bit easier. So what I've got right here is my slip transfer newsprint, which is ready to actually put on the clay itself. And I'm gonna go ahead and remove it and place it onto the clay. So I've laid it down, and I'm gonna go ahead and use my rib and rib this out pretty well. Now I'll move this out of the way a bit. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing. And I'm just gonna make sure that this makes really good contact and that I've squeegeed this out really well, because essentially what I've created is a monoprint. So I'm gonna take my knife and I'm gonna go ahead and cut out the shape. Now what I do on the top is just cut straight across the top and remove the excess clay. And just move that out of the way. And then I'm gonna cut the bottom. And I'm gonna keep that little bit of extra clay, as I believe that's enough to make the base of my pot. And then I'm going to take my knife and hold it at about a 45-degree angle like this and cut both of the seams. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, holding it at exactly the same angle and cut again. And just remove this bit of clay. Now with my scraps, I've got a bucket of water here. I just go ahead and throw those into my little bowl of water just to keep them wet, and I'll pull them out in just a little while to wedge them up so I can use them again. So I'm going to use the scoring rib. This is probably difficult to see, but there's a pretty fine tooth on this, and I'm going to go ahead and score one side of this. And while keeping my slip transfer on the slab, I'm not moving it yet, and you can kind of see it sort of lightly, probably on the surface of the clay. I'm going to go ahead and score this inner seam. Now, if you're looking at this sideways, you can see that there's a distinct bevel on both sides of the seam, and those seams are there. The bevel is there, one, to increase the surface area of the joining itself, but also because it sort of minimizes the thickness of the clay, of two pieces of clay built up on each other. So once I have these nice and scored, I'm gonna go ahead and add slip to help glue this together. And the slip that I'm using is nothing more than the clay body, which is the white Phoenix clay, that's been dried out and then mixed with a little vinegar to rehydrate it. So I'm gonna go ahead and take the excess off. Before I sort of flip this over, I'm gonna fix the lip on this, and I'm gonna go ahead and use a damp sponge. And what I like to do is sort of dampen the lip a little bit and then take my finger and run it across the top to bevel that lip out. So now I've spent the time prepping this side. I'm gonna go ahead and flip this over and get ready to pull the transfer off and then build the cup. So I'm gonna grab my knife and I'm gonna go ahead and peel. Now this sometimes takes a little bit of time because oftentimes the slip sort of stays on the paper itself. So I might go back a couple of times with my rib to compress the surface to make sure that I'm getting all that painted information onto the clay itself. And you can sort of see how this is kind of coming apart. And there's a couple of areas where the slip sort of sticks to the paper still, so I just take a few minutes to make sure that that's sort of secured down. Now, it is true that you could probably pull this pretty quickly. If you leave the slip transfer on long enough, you won't mess up the registration, so I can actually see areas that are sort of sticking and go back and take them and sort of smooth it out again. And then I'll go ahead and pull it. So this is now a spent piece of paper, and I'm just gonna set that aside. Now what I have is a cup that's ready to actually assemble. So what I'm gonna do is just take my torch, sort of torch the surface briefly. And I'm gonna come over here to my turntable, and what I'm gonna do is just by grabbing the bottom corners, I'm just gonna pull this up and flip it onto the turntable. And then go ahead and compress that seam together. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and turn this around so you have a chance to see it. You can see that the seam is just like loosely put together right now. It's really important that this has a good join. So there's a couple of ways you can do, things you can do to facilitate that. One is you can use a wooden dowel, in this case it's a piece of PVC pipe, and stick it inside because it gives you a really nice surface to press against. And I can go ahead and kind of press that out with my finger so I make a good connection between both sides of the clay. And I also have in my drawer a little pony roller, and I'm gonna go ahead and roll that down. It is really important that you spend a lot of times looking at the seams and reinforcing your seams when you're building in slabs. I'll just move it to the side. And I'm gonna turn this and kind of set this up a little bit more, and then use another wooden tool. You can use any kind of tool that can get in there. This one happens to have a rounded edge, and go ahead and smooth that off. So what I'm gonna do to prep this, because it's the bottom of my cup, I could just make a decision to put a flat bottom on this, but you can see with this coffee cup right here, it has an undulating bottom. And the way I do that is I first square this off, and then I'll cut some contours in it. So what I'm gonna do is just take my fingers and square this off. I try to use the back seam, and this is the place where the handle is gonna be attached in the future, in between the squared off area. And then I just move around this way. So I just look at the seam, I make sure that I have a good join. And then I'm gonna take my finger and wet it in the water, and I'm going to go ahead and use a dampened finger to start contouring out this slab. Now, one of the reasons I like working with soft slabs this way is it gives me a chance to actually stretch the clay out and create a shape in the clay. You can see I'm moving all the way around, and I'm kind of trying to hold my fingers right here and push the clay out. You probably see it push out just a bit. So I'm going to take my fingers and kind of round off these areas. And I just want to make sure that the shape is actually really pleasing and has some regularity, so it's fairly symmetrical. And that looks to be about pretty good at this point. So this clay is quite soft. I can't really pick it up and show you, but what I'm gonna do is use my torch once again and set the bottom of this pot up. Now the reason I do this is it gives me a chance to use the bottom of this as a template to create the base. You can see that solidifies it quite a bit. It's not quite hard, it's still steaming hot. You have to be a little bit careful not to put too much flame on it, or it'll, the clay will actually pop off. And I'm just gonna go ahead and trim out some of these places in the middle of the feet, so to speak. So I'm sort of creating this foot. I like creating these feet because it lifts the pot a bit off the ground. And once again, I'm just gonna take those scraps and throw them in my water bowl. And that's pretty well set up. So now I've got this base, and I'm gonna get ready to put a base on top of it. So the way that I basically figure out the size of the slab of clay that I need is I'm just gonna take a little bit of clay, throw it out a little bit just to make sure it's large enough. Give it a quick little roll out. Compress one more time because this is actually super important. And then I'm gonna go ahead and lay this on top of the piece, just like that. So what I do is then, because the clay is soft, I'm able to take my fingers and gently push it down. What I'm doing is creating marks on the underside of this, which will give me a guide to cut the slab out. And you can see right here is the seam side. And what I'm gonna do is make sure that I put a little mark here that marks the seam. That makes it a lot easier after I cut it and put it back on again. So I'm gonna take this off, and you can see that there's certain marks right there, and that kind of gives me a guide to cut the slab out. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna cut this out, but I'm gonna cut a little bit on the outside of that line, probably about 1/8 of an inch larger than the slab marks itself. And because I'm cutting curves, I'm gonna use my needle tool. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that right now, really kind of quick. And now I've got a piece of clay that should fit this bottom pretty well. Well, it's not really actually ready to put on right at this moment. I've got to do a couple of things. I've got to score this surface and score this inner surface in here, and then add some slip to attach it. And further, there is an edge of the clay, and edges are always something that you have to mitigate and sort of get rid of. So what I'm going to try to do is smooth those first prior to putting them on the bottom of the plate. So I've got this sponge, and I'm going to go ahead and just roll around the edge of this. Make sure I round that off and compress. Now I could wait to do this after I've attached it to the pot itself, but it's actually much easier to do this in this state because it's flat. It's easy to get to. And all this sort of does is creates one less bit of work on the finishing end of this later on. Now, I always think that when you're working with slabs, it's important that you sort of think through the process altogether, and hopefully you can mitigate some of the problems that'll sort of show up in the future. So I've got this smoothed. I'm going to go back to the bottom right here, and I'm going to go ahead and score this bottom. So that's thoroughly scored in all different directions. If you do not have a scoring rib, other things that you could use, an old toothbrush, an old plastic comb, a plastic fork, there's just a number of things that you could use. Anything with a serrated edge will create a score mark. So I'm going to take the same rib and go ahead and score the bottom of my, the base of my pot, and I want to score in a couple of different directions. And usually I'm pretty wild about scoring this. I want to be fairly thorough, but you can see it gets pretty close to the edge, and because I know this edge is going to be showing on the outside of the pot, I'll go ahead and take my finger and kind of smooth some of that off. And this is ready, and so I'm going to take my slip and go ahead and apply it to the cup, not the foot base. And it just has to be light. It doesn't need to be like a super saturated solution, just enough to create slip and a kind of a glue to glue that slab back down to the pot. So that's applied. So I'm gonna go ahead and pick this up. I'm gonna find my mark, line that mark up with my seam on this side, lay this on, and then just gently with my fingers push this into place. This takes a little bit of time to maybe adjust it. Sometimes the clay gets a little stretched out or there's a little bit of movement, but because the clay is soft, it's really easy to adjust and sort of create the contours. Once I've got this sort of seated on the edge, I'm gonna go ahead and take my fingers and roll this clay around the edge. And I think this is a pretty important part because this is one of the things that seals this seam down. And because this is the bottom of a cup, I don't want any liquid or any cracks to occur which would allow liquid to leak out. That would not be a good coffee cup, I don't think. So what I'm doing is going ahead and just working my way around. This is not refined yet, and I don't really feel like I need to refine it at this moment. I usually wait until I've shaped the rest of the cup. One of my concerns at this point basically is this. I still want to shape this cup quite a bit, and I'm trying to get this foot stiff enough so I can stand the cup up and shape it before this clay gets too dry. So I've done that. I'm going to go ahead and take my finger and sort of compress this edge, just make sure it's down. That's pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and hit this with the torch again just to dry it out so I can flip it over. Test this, that's pretty good. And so at this point, I can go ahead and pick this up gently and just flip the cup. So now I have a cup, and sometimes it's a little uneven, so you can just take it and sort of pounce it down a couple of times, and that evens it out. If you look on the inside of this, you can see that there's clearly a seam at the bottom that needs to be addressed, and probably the seam up the side also needs to be addressed at this point. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and get my tool to smooth this out just a bit more. And I'm gonna go ahead and take my rib and start the shaping process of the cup itself. So you can see it's a little wonky. I've got a clean edge on this, it's moist. And I'm gonna go ahead and take my hand on the outside and gently caress the cup so I don't push it out too much. And because I have a turntable, this makes it much easier for me to actually sort of turn it so it keeps my contours fairly even. So I'm working this. And I'm constantly looking at the sides of the cup and also the contours. So I want to get down and sort of make sure I'm making good eye contact with this. And I'm just using this rib because it's soft and it also has a curved edge, which gives a really nice, constant kind of gradual curve. One of the things that's really great about templates is I think with hand building, it's really easy to not have a sort of standardized shape. And this actually allows you to have a fairly standard shape with still a lot of individuality. So I like hand building quite a bit because it allows me to create forms that are still one-offs. It's not a production piece. It still has a lot of individuality. I mean, depending on how I stretch the clay or how thick the clay is or how wet the clay is when I'm doing this, it actually can have a big effect on the form itself. And I like that process. I'm gonna go ahead and use this rib. And what I'm doing is I'm compressing this lip and making sure that the lip slants inward towards the middle of the cup. So at this point, you can see that the inside is fairly more regular and you can see the lip itself sort of slanting in. I'm going to go ahead and seal the bottom. So there's a couple of things you can do. I'm going to stick my finger underneath the indentation, so that gives me a way of smoothing the curves on the top without smishing down the foot because it is still quite soft. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm just going to work my way around. You can see that it's attached at least on the middle of the seams. And then the indentations toward the feet themselves, I'm actually going to roll up some clay and put in there because those holes shouldn't be there because it'll be really hard to clean it out. So what I've done is I've got some clay out of the bowl that's still wet. I'm going to dry my hands off. And I'm going to use this to actually fill. So I'm going to take this and roll a couple of balls. 4, in fact, because there are 4 feet. And I'm trying to make sure that the balls themselves are relatively even in terms of the amount of clay. There is a little bit of variation on the feet itself. So, I mean, if there's variation in these balls that you're rolling out, that's perfectly fine. I noticed that one is a little bit smaller than the rest, so I might actually add a little bit of clay to that. It's pretty easy to do. Just add clay and go ahead and keep rolling. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll each one of these balls into a sort of a taper, so it's thinner on one end and thicker on the other, and that allows me to drop it into the foot itself. So I'm going to do that with all of these. And I'm going to go ahead and wash my hands off a bit because I don't really like that feeling of drying clay on my hands. Use my rag. And then I'm just going to take each one of these balls and I'm going to go ahead and stick them in the bottom of the cup. So I'm going to take this ball, dip it in the slip, push it in, and go ahead and smooth it out. Now, I usually spend a little bit of time on this part of it because I think it's important that there's a nice smooth bottom on the bottom of the cup. You want a nice surface because it's a functional surface. It's also a surface that you end up looking at after you're drinking coffee. So take a little bit of time. Right now it's a little on the rough side, which is fine. I haven't really gotten in there a chance to refine it. But it's really important that you dip it in a little clay slip or some water to make sure that that ball sticks in there. And you can see that this tool is really great because it has this end on it and it allows me to get in there and actually really compress, which is what I'm doing. And you notice also I'm cleaning the end of my tool off each time because I just want to have that tool clean as possible. It makes it a lot easier, a little less messy on the inside. And then I'm just going to go ahead and push that clay in there. So at this point it looks pretty rough on the interior, which is okay because I'm going to fix that. So I've got that done. I'm going to go ahead and take this sponge, rinse off all the globs of clay, make sure it's really wrung out, not dry. I'm going to dry my hands off. And I'm going to pick this up just so you have an idea of what it looks like in the inside at this point. It's pretty rough and that's going to be fixed. So at this point, I'm taking my sponge and I'm going to go in here and gently compress those seams and smooth that area out. Take out all the marks. And make sure that that interior is smooth and the transitions between the floor or the floor of the pot and also the walls of the pot are consistent. And I probably would spend a little bit more time with this, but it's kind of hard to watch that. But you can see it's quite a bit smoother in the interior and it's pretty much completed at this point. So now I'm going to go ahead and check the form one more time. It's still a little bit flat on one side, I noticed that. And I'm going to walk over and get a tool, which I should have here with me that I use. I've got two of these round tools, and what I like about them is I can actually put them on the piece and make sure it's consistently round at the top. I like to do that. And I'm noticing a little flatness on this one side, so I'm going to work on that a bit. Now you could use anything. I've used the bottom of bottles, spray bottles, sometimes this, although it's a little heavy, although the diameter of it is actually fairly consistent to my coffee cup. I'm gonna go ahead and push this in here, and I'm putting this in here just to kind of hold the lips steady while I go ahead and take the torch and torch this. Pull that out. Now you notice at this point I still have not refined this edge yet. I'm going to do that last. But I'm going to go ahead and torch the interior of this. Now instead of a torch, you could use a hair dryer, or you could just use time. Actually, I'm just a little impatient with this process, so I always use a torch. And I'm going to refine the lip right now. So I'm going to use a piece of chamois leather that's been dampened and pretty wet. And I'm going to go ahead and spin this around. What I'm trying to do is make sure that this lip is smooth, that it's comfortable, and that it slants in and it has a kind of a consistency. The other thing it does, the lip, of course, as you know from past projects, is probably one of the most important aspects or a place to focus. This is kind of the punctuation of the pot itself, and it also is that point where you're going from the interior of the pot to the exterior, so it's a point of transition, which is always a visually important area to focus on. I'm going to go ahead and torch this one more time. So that's pretty good. And I can actually pick the cup up now. It's still quite soft. I mean, I could squeeze it and fold it up, but I'm just holding it really gently. And now I'm gonna take that same chamois leather and go ahead and refine this seam around the edge. Go ahead and smooth all that out and make sure that that seam is closed and will not open or crack during the firing. And what I'm doing is I'm just wrapping the chamois leather over my thumbnail, which gives me a good, it's like a nice tool to get into those areas where there's sort of a deeper crack. I'm gonna go ahead and still holding it pretty gingerly because I don't really want to crush the form at this point. Go ahead and finish that off. Now, you'll notice the seam of the pot is towards the camera right now, and it's a little bit rough. I'm gonna go ahead and refine that as well. What I'm gonna do, using the same chamois, I'm just gonna go ahead and pick this up and kind of smooth that area. I don't mind the seam showing at all, actually. What I don't like it to be is rough or sort of unseemly. Haha. At this point, a lot of this is going to be covered up because that's where the handle's going to go anyway. And at that point, it's pretty much done. So I'm going to take my chop, which is my signature, and go ahead and sign the bottom. Now, this pot is not ready for the handle yet. It's a little bit too wet. And normally what I do is throw a bag over this, and then the next day I come in and put a handle on it. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna wait, give this thing a chance to dry a bit, and then the next video I'll show you how to apply a handle. So I hope this helps everybody out. I really miss everybody in my class. At least you get a chance to see the inside of my studio. Maybe I'll give you a tour on one of the other videos. Just everybody stay safe and stay inside, flatten the curve. Bye.